Sorry about that. My machine just ran out of batteries while I was recording. As I was saying, this general constraint that that two adjacent obstruents in English must agree in voicing, that's visible elsewhere in the grammar. That seems to be a general principle of English phonology. So that's a nice point in favor of the analysis where this is the underlying representation. What about this principle that you can't have two coronal stops next to each other? Is that generally true in English? It is. There are no words in English that have a ta-da sequence in them, or a da-ta sequence in them, or a ta-ta sequence, or a da-da sequence. You don't get long or geminate stops in English the way you do in languages like Italian or Japanese or Arabic. And so it does look to be a much more general constraint of English phonology that you can't have two coronal stops next to each other, or more generally, that you can't have any two identical or near identical consonants next to each other. So we can't have adjacent coronal nasals, adjacent lateral liquids, or anything else in English either. This is a quite general constraint in English phonology. So this alternation, this rule that inserts a schwa in this context, or this constraint that says don't have two coronal stops next to each other, that makes sense as a general principle of English phonology. So it looks like this analysis with this underlying representation fits in well with our general picture of how English phonology works. What about the other kinds of things you need to do here? If you choose this, you're going to need to make a voicing rule that applies to obstruents following an obstruent. That kind of makes sense. That's that same voicing agreement constraint. But if this is the underlying representation, they're also going to need to voice when they're following a sonorant consonant or a vowel. Does that make sense with the general phonology of English? It doesn't. There's plenty of words in English that end in a vowel followed by a voiceless coronal stop, right? So plate happens to not be the past tense form of play, but it is still an English word, right? Plate is a word. There's no problem in general with having a voiceless stop following a at the end of a word. If you're going to write a rule or have a constraint that enforces that condition, it's going to have to be specific to the past tense morpheme. It's not even going to be a property of this voiceless coronal stop as a sound. It's only going to apply to this specific morpheme, and that's a much uglier theory of phonology than the one where we don't have morpheme-specific phonology. Similarly, for r or l or n, t can appear after all these sounds at the end of an English word. It just doesn't do so if it happens to be the past tense morpheme. It's much better to explain that by saying that this morpheme happens to be underlyingly voiced in the lexicon than it is to explain it by saying that there's a rule that changes this sound into this one in these contexts. That's an ugly solution. What else? If we assume that this is going to be the underlying representation, we're going to need a rule that deletes schwa when it's in between what? In between a voiced coronal stop and absolutely anything except for a coronal stop. So in the general case, if you had an ud sequence following a s or a f or a k, is it necessarily the case that you're always going to delete that schwa in English? It is not. There's plenty of English words that end in such a sequence following one of these sounds. Let's see if I can think of one. There's an insect called an aphid, and that's going to be something like this. Right. So this is a little tiny white insect that eats plants, and ladybugs get rid of them. They're kind of a nuisance. But no problem having this ud sequence at the end of a word following one of these sounds. Acid, rapid, and so on and so forth. These are all possible words in English. Lucid, same thing with these sounds. Avid, arid, and so on and so forth. There's no general problem with having an ud sequence following any of these sounds. So if you were going to write that rule, first of all, it's very hard to write because there's no way to even notate the context everywhere except following a coronal stop. But even if you could write it, it's a rule that again would only apply to the past tense morpheme and wouldn't be more generally active in the language. So that's again a much uglier analysis than the one we get if we assume that this is the underlying representation. Now, you're not always going to have this level of evidence in every language that we look at in this class. We all happen to be pretty proficient speakers of English and we know a lot about the language. But I did want to illustrate that there are considerations that go on into these analyses beyond just the narrow words under consideration. Right? There's one more issue here that we often comes front and center when we start talking about morphological or phonological alternations, and this has to do with productivity. Right? So when we're finding these patterns in surface data like this, we always have to ask, are these really active grammatical generalizations? Are these things that speakers really impose on novel forms? And with the case of regular plurals, I mean, it's pretty clear that this is exactly how you inflect novel words in English. If you get new nouns, you use these rules. But the more general principle of like, don't ever have obstruents next to each other that mismatch, is that really an active grammatical generalization? Because some of these might instead be accidents of history. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you look at irregular processes in English, these are ones that are pretty clearly not phonologically predictable or not morphologically predictable. You can still find phonological generalizations in them, right? So some irregular past tenses in English, sing, sang, ring, rang, sting, stung, fling, flung. These are irregular forms. Nevertheless, there are clear phonological generalizations here, that there are some English verbs, for instance, that form their past tenses by taking some sort of a front and or high vowel and changing it into a lower and or backer vowel in some ways. And this is actually an active process in Proto-Germanic phonology. There are two of them, ablaut and umlaut. And these were presumably real phonological principles 1,200 years ago. And similarly, you can even come up with a phonological generalization about where this tends to happen. It's usually or often occurs in verbs that end in velar nasals, like sing, ring, sting, and fling, in particular with velar nasals following a high front lax vowel. Right? So there's some phonological generalization here. Nevertheless, we're pretty sure that this is not an active principle of phonological of contemporary English phonology, right? Because there's also other verbs in English that end in ing that don't do this, right? And if you learn a new verb that ends in ing, and these kinds of experiments have been done, and ask an English speaker, hey, here's this new verb, ping. Actually, this one exists. But what would happen if you did it yesterday? They're not going to say, oh, well, today I ping, or today the aircraft pings, and yesterday it pung, right? That doesn't happen. People say yesterday it pinged on the radar, right? Something like that. And so in general, it's pretty clear that these are not productive principles of English phonology. And it's also pretty clear that these are, but there's a whole lot of stuff that falls sort of in between. Where so this ablaut umlaut example with sing, sung, fling, flung, this is what I was talking about in terms of historical accidents. Namely, English happens to have evolved from Proto-Germanic, and Proto-Germanic is a language that happened to have these phonological processes, but nevertheless, nowadays we just memorize these forms in our lexicon, and it is in some sense not a phonological generalization, it's just accidental, the way everything in the lexicon is. It's arbitrary. So there is no phonological generalization here in English, even though looking just at these surface forms, there is some information you can get from them. A lot of cases are not so clear on either side. And so here I'm trying to show you this general question of whether English will devoice a voiced stop when it occurs, or a voiced obstruent when it occurs next to another voiced obstruent. well, how could we get more evidence that bears on that? What if we could find other affixes that end in different, that begin in or end in different kinds of consonants, and create some illegal consonant clusters that have voiced and voiceless obstruents next to each other? Is this general principle that you devoice following a voiceless consonant, or that you voice following a voiced consonant? Can we see this more generally? And here the answer is I'm not sure. Right? So one possible example I found here is this English shun suffix, which is often spelled T-I-O-N, and it comes from Latin and French, from Romance languages. It takes on different forms depending on which word you put it on. But here's the issue. This shun suffix itself is not really productive in English. You can't add this to new words. And so it's not really clear whether you even want to derive these words from their component morphemes or just say that they're memorized in the English lexicon. So here's what I'm talking about. If you look at words with sonorants in them, you can get the default form of this, things like retention and repulsion. These seem to show us that in the absence of an obstruent next to this shun suffix, it occurs as voiceless. So presumably the underlying form is with a voiceless fricative sh at the beginning. What happens if you put it next to a voiced obstruent? Well, here are some examples. Absorb pretty clearly has a final voiced labial stop in it in English. You put the suffix on it, it becomes absorption with a voiceless stop instead. Same thing for describe, description. Similarly, receive, which ends in the voiced obstruent v, the labiodental fricative, that becomes reception. What about this stem extinguish? Well, if you try to add the shun suffix to it, you end up shortening the stem, but it does still devoice extinction with a voiceless k sound. So maybe there's some limited evidence from these words that this is a general principle of English phonology, that you don't get disagreeing voicing clusters for obstruents, although this is iffy, right? It's not obviously an accident like the sing-sung examples. It's not obviously productive like our normal past tense here. It's somewhere in between, right? The shun suffix is not productive. It can't be extended to new words. So maybe these 6 or 8 or 12 whatever words we have in English, maybe these are just memorized in the lexicon. On the other hand, when you do add this and you get these alternations, and absorb, absorption, that seems pretty straightforward, but they're also often accompanied by other phonological changes that don't seem to be general properties of English, like describe, description. They're the vowel changes. And that's not something that normally happens in English when you put two obstruents together. So there's going to be other stuff happening in here. Obvious example, extinguish, extinction. There's no general principle of English by which you delete whoosh at the end of a word or something like that. There has to be something arbitrary and irregular about this form. Same thing for receive, reception. This is not a general process of English. You don't generally turn a labiodental fricative into a labial stop when it's before another obstruent or something like that. That's not something you find elsewhere in English. It does generally happen with these Latinate verbs that end in sieve, though. Verbs like receive, perceive. If there were hypothetically a verb transceive, which I don't think there is, you could imagine that a noun that was created from it would be transception, and so on and so forth. Conceive. So this is not a clear-cut case of being totally regular and productive, right? It's not a clear-cut case of being totally arbitrary and an accident of history. It's somewhere in between. It's a little bit fuzzy what's going on here. Is this part of the grammar, or is it just a collection of historical facts that are frozen in the lexicon? And the point here is that sometimes in real life it can be very fuzzy. When you look at examples like this, there's not always a clear answer. So putting that aside for the moment though, all the examples we'll be looking at in this section of the class will be fairly clear answers. We're going to assume that everything we see is productive and is a part of the grammar. I did want to give you this more realistic view that in real life there's a continuum between clearly productive morphophonology and clearly unproductive morphophonology, and lots of stuff is somewhere in the middle and can be a little bit ambiguous.